As I already mentioned, this division of learning and all the related questions that Zuboff talks about is intimately connected to asymmetries of knowledge and power. So first of all, surveillance capitalism thrives on the public ignorance, out of convenience, out of laziness, but also out of a sheer inability to get to the right information. We simply do not know exactly what these big players, these big companies, do with the data they collect. We don't actually even know what data they collect. For example, a few years ago, it turned out that the Google Street View cars, as they were scanning and capturing images of the streets, of the houses on those streets, were also retaining information from Wi-Fi networks that they picked up as they drove along the streets. What do they do with this information? Well, especially in Germany, there were lawsuits fighting this particular form of data capture, and it was restricted. But again, time and time, we see this kind of colonial attitude. Information is taken. New territories are simply captured until somebody finds out and makes a fuss about it. And then what do? Well, if you sue Google, you have a long road ahead of you, and you very likely are going to lose. So surveillance capitalism thrives on the public ignorance, big and small, right? Ignorance of the individual, but also of the public at large as to what exactly these companies do. They aren't, after all, being run by elected officials who have some kind of accountability to the public. Furthermore, social dependency on certain technologies increases asymmetries. Think about it. If you have a business, how could you not use the internet today in order to sell your products and services? And how do you make sure that people find you? Well, it is through Google. You want to score high on Google's list so that when somebody looks for your services, your company will pop up on the first page of search results. But also socially, especially now that we are stuck at home, you want to stay in touch with other people. How do you do this? Through social media. And with every click, with every text message you send, information is gleaned about you and is packaged, sold, etc. But how could we resist this lure, right? Because the alternative seems to be to sit at home without any contacts and with a very limited profile online. Your company is also not going to do very well. So this asymmetry between the watched and the watchers grows the more these technologies become ubiquitous. What then is the proper response? Well, commonly we seem to tend towards resigned cynicism. Oh well, it is a grim state of affairs, but it is just how it is. We can't really do anything about it. And in addition to that, we are becoming psychically numb. At first, perhaps, there was a big furor about Google capturing, retaining our search histories, but today fewer and fewer people actually care because we're too used to this news. The Cambridge Analytica scandal was a big headline, but similarly, large scandals since have simply received less attention because we are becoming numb to this information. Now, returning once again to that quote you looked at before from Eric Schmidt, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. This quote in particular, I want you to consider in the context of China's social credit system, a video about which you watched through that link on Canvas. Now, we'll want to talk in class about this video and about whatever other information you might have about the social credit system and opinions and thoughts you might have on this theme. But again, I'm asking you to keep it in the back of your mind for the remainder of this recorded lecture so that we can draw on it in our live discussion. The same goes for that Black Mirror episode, Nosedive, or at least those scenes that again you watched through the links on Canvas. Now, these examples, fictional and factual, help us understand that worldview I previously mentioned that underlies the big data debate. It also allows us to say a lot more about privacy and really think about the issues related to that theme. But finally, and that concludes today's lecture, I want to say a few things about judgment. Hannah Arendt is a famous philosopher who wrote a beautiful book called The Human Condition, which came out in 1958. Now again, Zuboff is our contemporary. The article Big Other I've been referring to was published in 2015. Her book Surveillance Capitalism just came out last year. And yet Hannah Arendt, who wrote a long time ago, has some very profound things to say about the themes we're dealing with, both within the theoretical context in Zuboff and in our day-to-day lives today, before the crisis, but especially now during the COVID pandemic. So Hannah Arendt, in her book, writes about different forms of tyranny. And she says, today we ought to add the latest and perhaps most formidable form of such dominion, bureaucracy, or the rule of an intricate system of bureaus in which no men, neither one nor the best, neither the few nor the many, can be held responsible, and which could properly be called rule by nobody. Now, Arendt here is talking about state bureaucracy in particular, and she warns against its many dangers, which we don't have to go into here now. What's relevant to us is that what she warns of is a system in which not people can be held accountable, not individuals doing their jobs, but where somehow the rules themselves govern, where there's a system of rules, perhaps a very detailed system of rules, which gives the sense of neutrality, of objectivity, but which in fact, she says, should be called rule by nobody. She writes about this, rule by nobody is clearly the most tyrannical of all forms of dominion, since there is no one left who could even be asked to answer for what is being done. In the age of artificial intelligence, of machine learning and big data, this once again becomes incredibly relevant. Because something underlying the worldview we have been discussing so far is this idea that machines do, of course, all of or much of the data collection, and also sort this data, package it, manipulate it, control it, etc. Who in the end is responsible when machines are doing so much of the work, when so much of the work is being done not by people applying certain rules, but by machines applying these rules, by software that is written in a certain way in order to get stuff done. Now, the very word data seems to imply quantification. And one of the things that is among Hannah Arendt's greatest concern is the power we ascribe to numbers. You know this perhaps from that phrase, show me the numbers, where usually it is implied that what matters most are economic data, right? Financial numbers. And the idea is, according to her, that quantification is taking the place of personal judgment. If you can put numbers to something, if you can quantify it, then immediately you become much more believable than if you try to use any other kind of evidence. She adds to that, when numbers dominate, they become equated with what is real, and anything immeasurable comes to seem, if not unreal, then certainly illegitimate. Because think about it, if we are talking about big data, we are of necessity talking about things that can be measured. Now, if we base decisions on things that can be measured, that can be quantified, that can be expressed in numbers, then these decisions necessarily leave out of consideration anything that cannot be quantified. Now, you may say, okay, perhaps in big data, things are being quantified that aren't strictly quantifiable, but yet you can approach them with numbers. Like, for example, those states or cities or governments that try to put a number on the happiness of their citizens, right? And you have these happiness indices showing how happy people are in one country compared to the next. I think you might rightly say that happiness cannot be expressed in a number, and yet people try. So really we have two problems. We have the problem of trying to express in numbers something that really escapes quantification, like for example, happiness. And on the other hand, things that nobody has thought of quantifying and that therefore drop out of the picture entirely because nobody can figure out a way to put a number on them. So again, when numbers dominate, they become equated with what is real. What you cannot measure does not exist. Arendt, again, from The Human Condition, writes that no law, no regulation, protocol, or algorithm is so unambiguous that it can be applied in situations without remainder. What she means here is that no matter how hard you study the rules, be they legal rules, moral rules, it really doesn't matter. No matter how hard you study the rules, there always will have to be, in any situation, personal judgment involved. That is to say, you, in the end, are responsible for applying a rule. If you are a judge, if you are a lawyer, then you have a lot of experience with this, but also in our day-to-day personal lives, applying the moral rules is very complicated. Because yes, we may agree that, for example, we should not steal or we should not murder. Or perhaps slightly closer to home, that we should not lie. But what about those situations where another value is, for example, being compromised? That we should, for example, be friendly whenever we can, and where that conflicts with our duty not to lie. Personal judgment is called for when we weigh one against the other, and knowledge of the rules is never in and of itself enough to apply the rules well. We need personal judgment for that. During the live portion of today's class, we will talk about Hannah Arendt's statement in the context of those different videos you've watched through Canvas. In particular, we'll want to talk about a few more quotes from Arendt, these from Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is a 1964 book she wrote about the Nazi Eichmann, who in the 60s was on trial for his role in organizing the Holocaust. Arendt writes, "Judgment is that cognitive ability which makes possible the bringing together of different elements in the absence of a rule for doing so." Furthermore, she talks about discretion, an interpretation of particular situations, a weighing of circumstances in order to decide what to do. And finally, a willingness to judge in the absence of unarguable guidelines. Now, what I want you to start thinking about, and what we will discuss in class, how these issues of personal judgment and discretion are compromised in the kind of situations you see in both that Black Mirror episode and in China's social credit system, as it is explained in that video. What is it about big data that makes it harder for us to act as autonomous individuals who can form our own personal judgments and act with discretion as understood by Arendt here? Arendt rather ominously writes, "It is not necessary to have a wicked heart in order to do great evil, only to fail to think." So in fact, according to Arendt, and according to Zuboff many years later, the threat to our personal autonomy, to our personal judgment posed by big data is a very significant one. It is not just one of convenience or privacy or security understood as trivial matters. It threatens the very fiber of our democracy. Such, at least, is the claim both in Arendt, writing many years before big data even became a thing, and Zuboff, writing today. In the live portion of today's lecture, we will picking up right where this lecture leaves off. We will both go into Arendt's claims a little bit further, and I'm also very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Zuboff, the worldview underpinning big data and issues concerning privacy and judgment.